Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the chilling case of the Blackwood family, who disappeared without a trace from a quiet English village in 1965 that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. Irasakofothkin. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. There are stories of people who disappear, who slip through the cracks of the world and are swallowed by silence. These tales leave behind whispers, photographs that fade, and the cold, lingering ache of a question without an answer. And then there is the story of the Higgins family, a story that does not just ask a question, but tears open a wound in the very fabric of history, revealing a darkness so patient and profound it defies comprehension. In the autumn of 1965, a season of unnatural chill and brooding fog, the Higgins family, Thomas, his wife Elenina, and their two children, Margaret Rose and William, vanished from their stone cottage in the secluded English village of Ashworth, Yorkshire. There was no sign of a struggle, no ransom note, no frantic message left behind. It was a departure as quiet and complete as a candle flame extinguished in a sealed room. An exhaustive initial search of the surrounding moors yielded nothing but damp leaves as an impenetrable mist. With no evidence of foul play and no further leads to pursue, the local constabulary, frustrated and baffled, reluctantly moved the case to the inactive file. For 3 months, silence was the only reply from the empty Higgins home. But silence, as Ashworth was about to learn, can be deceptive. It can be a shroud, a veil drawn over horrors that have not gone away, but are merely waiting. The discovery was made not in the cottage, but in the heart of the village itself, beneath the cold flagstones of the ancient St. Jean Mary's Church, following a lead from a parishioner's vague recollection of recent unauthorized work. Investigators uncovered a hidden room, a stone chamber whose air was still and heavy, untouched by the modern world. The air carried the scent of cold earth, damp stone, and something else, something metallic and cloyingly sweet. Inside, arranged with unnerving care, were the personal belongings of the Higgins family. Elenina's wedding band rested on a corner of a massive stone altar. Thomas's pocket watch sat beside it, its face cracked. Young Margaret's favorite red hair ribbon was pinned to the altar's edge, and little Billy's worn tin soldier stood vigil near a circle of melted, blackened candles. They had not been discarded. They had been placed, offered. Alongside these heartbreaking relics lay a collection of handwritten journals. Most were brittle with age, but one was recent, its ink still dark against the page. Its entries detailed forbidden rites and forgotten beliefs that the Church of England had officially outlawed centuries ago. But it was the final entry that stopped the investigators' hearts. It was a frantic, scrawled passage, and it was dated 2 weeks after the Higgins family had reportedly vanished from the face of the earth. The existence of that entry posed a question that transcended a simple missing persons case. It suggested that for the Higgins family, their story did not end with their disappearance. It had only just begun. To understand the seed of this horror, one must first understand the soil in which it was so successfully planted, the village of Ashworth itself. Ashworth was a place caught in amber, a village ringed by mist-shrouded moors and hills that bled purple with heather in the late summer. Tucked deep within the winding valleys of Yorkshire, it was a community that measured time not in years, but in generations. Nearly all of its 300 souls could trace their family lines back 5 or 6 centuries, often living in the very same handful of cottages as their ancestors. This was not merely a product of geography. It was a culture of insularity, a fiercely guarded tradition of keeping the outside world at a distance. Strangers were noted, their presence a disruption to the village's slow, ancient rhythm. At the heart of this isolated world stood St. Mary's Church, a breathtaking Norman relic whose weathered limestone tower soared nearly 100 feet into the brooding Yorkshire sky. Built in 1187 atop the suspected ruins of a much older Saxon chapel, the church had long been wrapped in folklore. Whispers passed down through generations, quiet as the rustle of autumn leaves, claimed that the land itself had been considered sacred long before the first Christian missionaries reached these hills. The massive iron-banded oak doors seemed to groan under the weight of this history, and the wind that rolled endlessly down from the moors often carried with it a sound like a low, ceaseless chant. But something in the autumn of 1965 was different. A strange, penetrating chill had settled over the village, a cold that bit deeper than the season alone could explain. The trees turned early that year, their leaves erupting in shades of crimson and gold that felt almost too vivid, too unnatural. As twilight fell, a thick fog began to seep into the valley, not rolling in from the hills, but appearing to rise from the damp earth itself. It was a sentient presence, coiling around the moss-covered gravestones of St. Mary's and clinging to its cold stone walls. Long-time residents reported losing their bearings entirely when walking through the churchyard at dusk. Familiar paths seeming to shift and writhe as if the village itself had forgotten its own shape. Even the church bells were not immune. For centuries they had rung with punctual clarity. But that autumn, their sound deepened. Mrs. Agnes Petton, an elderly woman who had lived beside the church for over 6 decades, noticed it first. The bells no longer rang with a clean, sharp peal. Instead, they resonated with a strange heaviness, a sorrowful clang that seemed to be absorbed by the thickened air. Late at night, she sometimes swore she heard them tolling when they shouldn't be soft, dissonant echoes that seemed to rise from beneath the ground, not from the belfry above it. Into this simmering cauldron of history and foreboding stepped the Higgins family, a portrait of rural English piety, yet unknowingly chosen to be the final players in a drama that had been unfolding in the shadows for centuries. Thomas Higgins was not a man who believed in omens or superstition. At 38, he lived his life by routine and clockwork precision. He had inherited both his father's position as the village postmaster and his quiet, methodical nature. He was a man rooted in his faith, pious in the practical, unassuming way of the countryside. As a church warden at St. Mary's, he could be found every Sunday arranging the hymnals and polishing the collection plates with steadfast dedication. For a time, he had viewed his wife's growing interest in folklore as a harmless, if eccentric, hobby. He told himself it was merely her way of connecting with the history of her adopted home. Yet, in the quiet moments before sleep, a cold seed of doubt had begun to sprout. He saw the faraway look in her eyes, the way she now spoke of energies in the land, and a disquiet he could not name would settle in his chest, a feeling he would promptly push away with a silent prayer come morning. His belief was a shield, but he was beginning to feel the first hairline fractures appearing upon its surface. His wife, Elenina, was the quiet heart of their home. Having arrived in Ashworth 15 years earlier as a young bride, she ran their cottage with a structured grace that matched her husband's precision. But unlike Thomas, there was a subtle restlessness in Elenina, an inward pull towards something older, something more mysterious than the Anglican faith she practiced on Sundays. Her garden was a quiet rebellion against the orderly flower beds of her neighbors. It was a tangle of herbs and wildflowers, plants the older villagers recognized from their grandmother's time, herbs once cultivated for purposes long since banished from polite conversation. When asked, Elenina would simply smile and say she liked preserving old traditions, though she never explained which traditions she meant. Their children were the pride of Ashworth's small schoolhouse. Margaret Rose, the elder at 12, was a serious, introspective girl who possessed an uncanny maturity, a gravity that made her seem far older than her years. It was as though she carried some ancient knowledge, one that weighed silently on her young shoulders. She loved to read, particularly books on history and mythology, and could often be found sitting among the gravestones of St. Mary's, carefully copying the weather-worn inscriptions from the oldest headstones into a little notebook she kept always at her side. Her younger brother, William, whom everyone called Billy, was the village's undisputed charmer. At just 8 years old, he had a laugh that could light up the gloomiest Yorkshire morning. Yet, as that strange autumn deepened, something began to change in him. He became obsessed with drawing, filling notebook after notebook with sketches that grew darker and stranger. They were unsettling images that disturbed his teacher in ways she couldn't quite explain. Miss Sarah Collins had arrived in Ashworth that summer, a bright-eyed teacher from Exeter. She was an outsider, and it was through her clear, unburdened eyes that the first cracks in Ashworth's idyllic facade became visible. She saw the vacant, distant look that had begun to settle on Margaret. But it was Billy's drawings that truly alarmed her. Page after page depicted the same scene, robed figures gathered around an ornate altar, its surface carved with strange, coiling symbols. There was a primitive wrongness to the images that made her skin crawl. When she tentatively showed one of the more disturbing sketches to the headmistress, a woman born and raised in Ashworth, the older woman simply adjusted her spectacles, offered a thin smile, and dismissed it. "Boys have such active imaginations, dear," she had said, her tone light but her eyes firm. "And the Reverend takes such a keen interest in teaching them our local history. It's nothing to worry about." The message, unspoken but clear, was to let the matter rest. Miss Collins was new here. She did not yet understand the Ashworth way, but she understood what she saw in Billy's eyes when he drew, and when he told her, in a quiet, matter-of-fact voice, "Mummy and the Reverend taught me." She knew, with a certainty that defied all polite dismissal, that this was far more than just a child's imagination. The polite dismissal from the headmistress was a wall of glass, transparent yet unbreakable. It confirmed for Miss Collins that the strangeness in Ashworth was not a secret to be discovered, but a truth to be protected, while she wrestled with a sense of powerlessness, the very source of her concern. Elenina Higgins was being drawn deeper into the world that had so transformed her children. The catalyst arrived on a crisp September morning, a formal invitation, delivered by hand from the rectory, written on thick, cream-colored parchment in the Reverend's elegant script. It was an invitation to join the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society. The society, as Reverend Harold Whitmore presented it, was an intellectual sanctuary. Its meetings, held weekly in the oak-paneled vestry of St. Mary's, were at first a scholarly delight for Elenina. The group was small. Exclusive Dr. Edmund Carr, the village physician whose family had tended to Ashworth for generations. Miss Margaret Thornton, the librarian who acted as the village's unofficial memory. A handful of other landowners whose names were etched onto the oldest gravestones in the churchyard. Here, Elenina's inquisitive mind, so often stifled by the mundane cycles of domestic life, was not just welcomed, it was celebrated. Reverend Whitmore was a master orator. He would stand before them, his tall frame illuminated by candlelight, and weave spells with his words. He blended verifiable history with intoxicating folklore, speaking of ley lines that pulsed with telluric energy beneath their very feet, of pre-Roman farming practices that were not just agricultural, but spiritual, and of the subtle pagan influences on Christian holidays that he framed not as corruption, but as a deeper, more primal truth that the modern church had forgotten. He would often single Elenina out, praising her insights on herbalism or her intuitive understanding of seasonal folklore. "You see, Mrs. Higgins," he would say, his voice resonating with warmth, "some of us are born with the memory of the old ways still singing in our blood. It is not a thing to be learned, but to be reawakened." For a woman who had always felt a quiet disconnect from her surroundings, these words were a powerful validation. She was not just an enthusiast, she was an heir. The Society's activities soon progressed from mere discussion to practical demonstrations. Their first was a seemingly innocent ceremony to mark the autumn equinox. In a secluded glade on the moors, the small group gathered at twilight. They lit a bonfire, not of ordinary wood, but of rowan and oak, chanting ancient verses in a dialect Elenina had only ever seen in dusty books. They cast bundles of herbs into the flames, each with a specific meaning, a specific prayer for balance and protection. The air grew thick with fragrant smoke, and in the flickering firelight, the faces of her respected neighbors seemed to transform, their features sharpening, their eyes reflecting a shared, fervent intensity. It was hypnotic, powerful, and it felt profoundly right. Thomas, for his part, initially welcomed the change. He saw a new light in his wife's eyes, a renewed energy. He was pleased she had found a respectable hobby. Yet, his relief was short-lived. He noticed the Society's exclusivity. When Mr. Elias Vance, the retired historian from London, approached the Reverend about membership, he was met with a refusal that was as polite as it was absolute. "We are, at present, working on a very specific, long-term project," Whitmore had explained, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "A closed research group?" "Mr. Vance," his curiosity piqued, took to the county archives. He searched for any official record of an Ashworth Historical Preservation Society. There was none. He spoke to a local farmer at the pub, casually mentioning the society. The man's friendly demeanor vanished. He drained his pint, mumbled something about old families and their ways, and promptly left. A wall was being erected around Mr. Vance, and his historian's instinct told him that such walls are built not to preserve history, but to hide it. Inside the Higgins cottage, the pressure began to build, a slow, suffocating tightening. It was in the small things. At first, a dead crow, perfectly preserved, laid on their front doorstep one morning. Elenina swept it away, murmuring it was a gift from a cat. But her hands were steady, her eyes untroubled. Thomas found strange symbols, drawn in what looked like chalk, on the inside of the children's wardrobe. They were gone the next day. He felt like he was losing his mind, seeing shadows in a house that was suddenly no longer his own. The breaking point arrived on a cold, rain-lashed evening in early October. While searching for a spare blanket in an old wooden chest, his fingers brushed against something hard and cold, wrapped in oiled cloth. It was heavy. Unwrapping it, a wave of nausea washed over him. It was a dagger, its blade a dark, pitted iron honed to a wicked edge. The hilt, carved from yew wood, was inlaid with coiling symbols that mirrored the disturbing images from his son's notebooks. It was an object of undeniable antiquity, radiating a palpable sense of purpose. A purpose that was not benign. That night, he confronted Elenina. He held the dagger out, his hand trembling, the object feeling like a venomous snake. He expected denial, fear, anger. He received none. Elenina looked at the dagger with a look of serene, almost holy reverence. "It is a tool of understanding. Thomas," she said, her voice a terrifying counterpoint to his own ragged breathing. "One cannot truly comprehend the old ways by merely reading. To feel a conviction of our ancestors, one must hold the instruments of their belief." Her logic was a twisted, airtight cage. She had crossed a threshold, and Thomas realized, with a lurch of his stomach, that she was trying to pull him and their children across it with her. From that night forward, Thomas's health began to decline. Dr. Carr's notes document his patient's complaints of acute nervous exhaustion, unrelenting insomnia, and a constant, gnawing feeling of doom. During one visit, Thomas, desperate, confided in the doctor about the dagger. Dr. Carr listened patiently before leaning back in his leather chair. "Thomas," he said, his voice laced with practiced sympathy, "a man's mind can play tricks on him when he is under strain. You work too hard. And Elenina, she is a passionate woman. Perhaps what you see as sinister is merely her dedication to a historical craft. Have you considered that your anxiety might be the problem, not her hobby?" Thomas left the surgery feeling worse than when he had arrived, not only afraid, but also ashamed, as if his own sanity were failing him. He was being gaslit by the entire village infrastructure. Meanwhile, Miss Collins's own anxieties solidified into fear. The children were becoming automatons. Margaret now spoke with an odd formality, using archaic words she couldn't possibly have learned in school. One night, Billy woke up screaming. When Thomas and Elenina rushed to his side, he was sobbing about the man in the stone room who doesn't like the light. Elenina held him close, whispering soothingly that it was just a bad dream about a story she'd told him. But Thomas saw the flicker of shared, secret understanding that passed between his wife and son. By the last week of October, Thomas Higgins was a ghost. The methodical postmaster had become a gaunt figure, his eyes wide with the terror he could no longer conceal. He knew appealing to Elenina was futile. He knew Dr. Carr was part of it. There was only one source of authority left, one final, desperate hope: the Reverend Harold Whitmore. On a Tuesday afternoon, under a sky the color of a bruise, Thomas walked the short path to the rectory. The familiar journey felt alien. The smiles from neighbors seemed like predatory grins. Every cottage window looked like a watching eye. The Reverend's study was a claustrophobic sanctum. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, beeswax, and a strange, sweet incense. The shelves were filled with forbidden-looking tomes. The floor was crowded with ritual objects, carved stones, ceremonial bowls, and fragments of bone. Reverend Whitmore welcomed him with a calm, paternal smile, listening intently as Thomas poured out his fears, the dagger, his wife's transformation, the children's nightmares, his own failing health. He pleaded with the vicar as a man of God to intervene, to restore his family. When Thomas finished, his voice raw, the reverend's smile remained, but it was now a mask. His eyes held a cold, appraising light. He rose and walked to a shelf, picking up a heavy, leather-bound book. "The faith you practice on Sunday." "Thomas," he began, his voice low and solemn, "it is a simplified story, written for a world that has forgotten its own strength. It is a nursery rhyme, sung to soothe a child. But we are not children." He spoke of duties that transcended personal feelings, of ancient responsibilities passed down through bloodlines, and of the immense danger of turning away from rituals that had, he claimed, kept Ashworth safe and prosperous for centuries. "Your family, Thomas," the Reverend said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "was not chosen by chance. This land remembers. It has a long memory for debts and for vows. Your wife understands the honor. Your children, in their purity, are closer to the truth than you are. They are beginning to understand." What had begun as a plea for help had transformed into a warning wrapped in the language of divine providence. The Reverend never explicitly threatened him. He did not need to. The message was unmistakable. The Higgins family's involvement was not a hobby. It was not voluntary. It was a required, sacred sacrifice. Thomas Higgins left the rectory a broken man. The last vestiges of his hope had been extinguished, replaced by a certainty so cold and vast it was a form of suffocation. He was not fighting a strange belief system. He was caught in the gears of an ancient machine. His family had been chosen, not for an honor, but for an offering. And the time for that offering was drawing terrifyingly, inexorably near. Thomas Higgins's final days were lived in a state of quiet, suffocating terror. The knowledge he carried was a poison for which there was no antidote, a crushing weight that bowed his shoulders and stole the light from his eyes. The vibrant world he had once known, grounded in faith and routine, had faded to a monochrome landscape of dread. Then, on the night of Halloween, under a sliver of a cold moon that offered no comfort, the gears of the ancient machine, lubricated by decades of blood and belief, finally clicked into place. And the Higgins family was gone. The official investigation, led by Sergeant Robert Henley, began as a slow descent into frustration. For weeks that stretched into months, Henley, an outsider to Ashworth's tangled roots, felt as though he were pushing against a wall of thick, damp cotton. He was met with practiced sympathy, circular stories, and the same placid, impenetrable smiles. He interviewed every resident, his notebooks filling with contradictions and carefully worded evasions. The community's narrative was too consistent, their collective amnesia too convenient. He felt the unseen weight of a conspiracy, a silent, coordinated agreement to protect a secret he couldn't yet name. His superiors suggested he close the file, attributing the disappearance to a family simply choosing to leave their old life behind. But Henley couldn't shake the image of the children's drawings Miss Collins had provided, or the chillingly specific premonitions of the retired historian, Mr. Vance. He refused to let the silence win. Driven by a professional instinct that bordered on obsession, He returned to the one place that connected every thread, St. Mary's Church. He spent days with the church's old blueprints, comparing them to the physical structure. It was tedious, painstaking work, until he found a discrepancy in a 19th century schematic. A void behind the main altar, a space that shouldn't exist. This was not luck. It was the reward for refusing to accept a comfortable lie. With 2 junior officers as witnesses, he returned to the church. The air was cold, the silence profound. Behind the altar, he measured, he tapped, and he listened, until he found the section of wall that sounded hollow. The stones were heavy, sealed by time and humidity. The grinding sound they made as they were pried loose was the first protest the church's secret had voiced in decades. The air that rushed out was ancient and foul, carrying the sweetish odor of decay and burnt herbs. At the bottom of the worn stone steps, the beam of Henley's torch cut through the primordial darkness. The circular chamber was a shrine to a forgotten god. He saw the strange, carved tools, the shards of pottery, the remnants of countless fires. Then his light fell upon the altar. It was here that the abstract mystery crashed into concrete, heartbreaking reality. The personal effects of the Higgins family were arranged with a chilling reverence, and beside them, on a small stone lectern, lay a recently written journal. Henley spent hours in that cold, silent tomb. The only sound his own breathing and the rustle of turning pages. Elanina Higgins's elegant script told a story of seduction and delusion, but her words hinted at a history she had learned from others, a history that wasn't fully explained. There were references to Blackwood's legacy and the First Covenant. Convinced there was more, Henley conducted a second, more thorough search of the chamber. He ran his hands along the cold floor, stone by stone, until he felt it a single flagstone that was not perfectly flush. Prying it up, he found a hollowed-out space, and within it, wrapped in oilskin to protect it from the damp, lay a second, much older ledger. Its leather cover was dry and cracked, its pages brittle with age. It was the conspiracy's Bible, the source of the rot. The confessions were not screamed in an interrogation room. They were written in patient, methodical ink. The older journal, the one bound in cracked leather, was a silent testament to a horror that had festered in Ashworth for over 40 years. Its earliest entries, dated 1922, belonged to Father Michael Blackwood. His initial writings were academic, but they quickly descended into a messianic obsession after his discovery of the chamber. "The soil of this place is hungry," Blackwood wrote in an entry from 1927, his script precise and chillingly lucid. "It is a common misconception that our Lord replaced the old gods. He did not. He simply built his house on top of theirs. And a wise tenant pays respect to the landlord. The old pacts require nourishment. The land gives prosperity, but it demands a tithe not of coin or crop, but of life force itself, to maintain the great cycle." This twisted theology became his justification for murder. The journal became a clinical chronicle. The first account appeared under the date October 1930. The selection of the Morrison family was logical, Blackwood rationalized. They are new, without deep roots to trouble the soil. Their departure will be a brief curiosity, their essence a potent nourishment for the covenant. It is not an act of cruelty, but one of agricultural necessity, weeding the garden to ensure the health of the whole. This detached prose was repeated. The Hartwells in 1933, the Spencers in 1936, the Dunbars in 1939. Each entry detailed the selection, the grooming, and the offering, followed by pragmatic notes on the disposal of remains in the connected cave system and the seamless absorption of their property. The journal ended abruptly in 1942. "I have opened a door. and I fear what now walks in our blood. Elenina Higgins's journal provided the modern psychological counterpoint. It was a harrowing map of a mind being systematically dismantled and rebuilt. Tonight, Reverend Whitmore spoke of the Great Cycle. She wrote in an ecstatic entry from the summer of 1965. He explained that we are not ending lives, but merely transitioning them. We are midwives to a sacred process, guiding souls back to the earth from which all life springs. To be chosen is the highest honor. The fear one feels is merely the soul's attachment to its temporary vessel. Later, as Thomas's resistance grew, her tone became laced with sorrowful pity. My dearest Thomas struggles. His heart clings to the simple stories of the new faith. He cannot see the beauty in this final act of communion. Last night, I held Margaret's hand and explained to her the importance of her role. And she nodded, her eyes so full of ancient understanding. She is purer than us all. I pray that in the final moments, Thomas's spirit will see the grace we are being given through her eyes, and he will not be afraid. The two journals told a single, unbroken story, a legacy of ritual murder, passed from one priest to the next. Whitmore had discovered Blackwood's legacy, and, far from being horrified, saw it as a divine inheritance. He had simply refined the method, adding psychological manipulation to Blackwood's brutal pragmatism. The arrests began at dawn, a quiet, methodical sweep that severed the rot from Ashworth. Dr. Carr was taken from his surgery. Mrs. Thornton, the librarian, was arrested among her silent, leather-bound books, her face a mask of cold indignation. The final arrest was that of Reverend Whitmore, found in the hidden chamber, his clothes soiled, his eyes vacant. He was a man whose mind had finally fractured under the weight of his own monstrous theology. The trial, held at the York Crown Court in the spring of 1966, became a national sensation. The media descended upon the small village, painting it as the village of the damned. The prosecution, led by a sharp, methodical Queen's Counsel, laid out the story piece by piece. This case, he stated in his powerful opening, is not about a momentary madness. It is about a calculated generational conspiracy that turned a place of sanctuary into a slaughterhouse and men of God into butchers. The defense attorneys, faced with the damning evidence of the journals, attempted a desperate strategy to paint their clients as victims themselves, caught in the web of a shared psychotic disorder passed down from the original madman, Father Blackwood. This defense crumbled under the weight of testimony. Dr. Carr on the stand initially presented himself as a calm professional, but under cross-examination, his composure cracked, revealing an arrogant fanaticism. "You call it murder," he spat at the prosecutor. "I call it the preservation of a community. You, with your modern, soulless world, cannot comprehend the necessities of a deeper reality." But it was Miss Sarah Collins's testimony that brought the courtroom to a heartbreaking silence. With tears in her eyes, she presented Billy's drawings to the jury. As the disturbing images were passed from hand to hand, a collective gasp went through the room. The defense barrister tried to discredit her. "Is it not possible you simply misinterpreted the robust local customs?" he sneered. Miss Collins looked not at him, but at the jury. "I know what a child's imagination looks like," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "And I know what terror looks like. That boy was terrified." In his closing argument, the prosecutor held up the two journals. "These two books," he declared, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom, "are the beginning and the end of this evil. One, written with the cold arrogance of a man who believed he was a god. The other, with the tragic, manipulated fervor of a woman he convinced to sacrifice her own family. There is no shared madness here. There is only a chain of predators and prey, and it is your duty to break that chain forever. The jury, a collection of stoic Yorkshire farmers and townspeople, returned after only a few hours. Their faces were grim, their duty clear. One by one, the verdicts were read. Dr. Carr guilty, Mrs. Thornton guilty, 4 other members guilty, Reverend Whitmore guilty, but legally insane as the defendants were led away. A stunned silence fell over the villagers in the gallery. Justice, in its slow, methodical way, had been served. But for Ashworth, the judgment was only the beginning of a much longer, more agonizing sentence. The truth had been exposed, but rather than cleansing the village, it had poisoned the wellspring of its identity forever. The justice meted out in the York courtroom did not bring closure to Ashworth. It signed its death warrant. The verdicts, carried back to the village on the whispers of returning attendees and the stark headlines of national newspapers, did not cleanse the community. They shattered it. The truth, once revealed, was a contagion, an invisible plague of knowledge that seeped into the soil, poisoned the well, and turned neighbor against neighbor, not with open hostility, but with a far more corrosive force, shame. The heavy, complicit silence that had once protected a conspiracy now returned to haunt the village. But this time it was a silence born of unbearable awareness, of glances averted in the street, of lifelong friendships curdling into the bitter residue of mutual suspicion. A quiet, desperate exodus began, an anti-pilgrimage away from a desecrated holy land. It was not a rush, but a slow, heartbreaking bleed of life from the valley. The Prestons, a family who had farmed the same patch of land since the Tudor era, sold their prized livestock for a fraction of its worth and left with only what they could fit in their lorry, never looking back. The wife later confessed to a distant relative that she could no longer stand the silence in the village, a silence that, in her words, felt heavier and louder than any scream. They were not alone. One by one, families packed their belongings in the dead of night, their movements furtive, as if they themselves were fugitives. They were not just leaving a place, but fleeing a memory, trying to outrun a stain they knew, with dawning horror, was now part of their own identity. The outside world, which Ashworth had so long resisted, now descended upon it like vultures. Cynical journalists from London tabloids arrived, their cameras flashing, turning profound communal agony into a ghoulish spectacle. They were followed by amateur paranormal investigators with bulky equipment, hoping to capture echoes of the suffering on tape. And then came the others, the quiet ones, who would park their cars at the edge of the village and simply stare. Some, it was rumored, were distant relatives of other families who had vanished from the English countryside over the years, drawn to Ashworth by a terrible intuitive recognition. This final violation of their privacy was the last straw for many of the remaining residents. The village's infrastructure rotted from the inside out. The local economy, once self-sufficient, collapsed entirely when whispers of the devil's land made Ashworth produce unsellable at regional markets. The school, its classrooms echoing with ghosts, closed its doors in 1968. The Shepherd's Rest pub fell silent, its rusted sign creaking a lonely rhythm in the wind. And in a final, deeply symbolic act, the village post office, once run with quiet dignity by Thomas Higgins, was shuttered, its windows boarded up like sightless eyes. Ashworth was dying, not from a curse in the soil, but from a cancer of the soul. The most dramatic surgery was performed on the village's heart. In the summer of 1967, the Church of England. In an unprecedented move, officially deconsecrated St. Mary's Church. The ritual was stark and somber. Officials in ceremonial robes performed the ancient rites of desacralization, their Latin prayers a strange counterpoint to the drone of the bulldozers waiting nearby. They declared the ground unholy, forever tainted by the acts it had concealed. The demolition was methodical. The ancient Norman tower, which had stood for 800 years, was brought down in a cloud of dust and regret. The stones that had witnessed generations of life were hauled away like rubble. Finally, they turned to the profane wound in the earth beneath it, the hidden chamber. The site of unspeakable horrors was filled with tons of liquid concrete, a modern attempt to entomb an ancient evil. But one cannot kill a memory by destroying the walls that housed it. The land remembered. The fields surrounding the now barren plot were said to be forever fallow, and a palpable coldness lingered there. Even on the brightest summer day, the legacy of Ashworth extended far beyond its crumbling stone walls, leaving indelible scars on the people and institutions it touched. The journals, the ritual dagger, the children's drawings, these artifacts were not destroyed. They became police evidence, logged and numbered, and were eventually transferred to a secure university archive, where they remain to this day. They are Exhibit A in the study of human depravity, objects of intense academic fascination that still radiate a profound and terrible energy. For the survivors, the psychological cost was incalculable. In her seminal 1978 book, The Ashworth Contagion, A Study in Communal Trauma, sociologist Dr. Perdue Althea Rowe described the phenomenon as a complete inversion of communal identity. She wrote, "The shared history and traditions that had been a source of pride and stability for centuries became, overnight, a source of collective guilt and horror. The very act of identifying as being from Ashworth became a mark of shame. The children who grew up in the shadow of the trials were particularly affected. They learned that the kindly doctor who had treated their fevers, the librarian who had nurtured their love of reading, and the priest who had baptized them were all part of a monstrous conspiracy. The betrayal was absolute, severing the fundamental trust that underpins a healthy society. And what of the heroes, the outsiders who broke the silence? Sergeant Robert Henley was promoted to detective inspector for his work, but the case haunted him. He suffered from insomnia for years, tormented by the contents of the journals he had been the first to read. He transferred to a different constabulary a year after the trial, seeking an escape from the shadows of Ashworth that lingered in his mind, and never spoke of the case publicly again. Miss Sarah Collins left the teaching profession altogether. The trauma of seeing innocence so horrifically betrayed extinguished her passion. She moved to the coast, seeking the cleansing power of the sea. But the faces of Margaret and Billy Higgins remained with her for the rest of her life. The institutional failure exposed by the Ashworth case prompted seismic changes. A parliamentary inquiry in 1969 concluded that the Church of England's culture of clerical deference and the police's lack of centralized data on missing persons had created the perfect storm of neglect that allowed the cult to operate for decades. The Church enacted sweeping reforms, establishing stricter oversight for rural parishes. British law enforcement underwent a reckoning, with the Ashworth investigation becoming a landmark case study that led to the creation of new national protocols for investigating missing families. Yet, a chilling question lingered. Father Blackwood's journal had made oblique references to sister congregations, specifically mentioning a meeting with a vicar from the Fens who understood the old ways and a coded list of parishes, one in the silent valleys of Northumbria. The authorities publicly dismissed these as delusions. But no formal investigation was ever launched. The unsettling possibility remains, was Ashworth an isolated anomaly? Or was it merely one cell in a wide and hidden network of ancient belief that continues to lie dormant beneath the placid surface of the English countryside? The official record is silent, and so we are left, not with a resolution, but with a profound and enduring warning. The story of Ashworth is ultimately not about pagan gods or ancient curses. It is about a horror far more intimate, the darkness within the human heart, and the terrifying ease with which decency can curdle into complicity. The evil that consumed the village did not arrive as a monstrous force. It arrived as a charismatic intellectual who offered a sense of purpose. It wore the face of a trusted doctor, a knowledgeable librarian, a devout neighbor. It was an evil that understood human nature perfectly. It did not need to use force when it could use a far more powerful tool, the technology of belief. It weaponized our deepest needs for community, for meaning, for protection from a chaotic world, and twisted them into a justification for atrocity. The true terror of Ashworth lies in its revelation that monsters are rarely obvious. They do not have fangs and claws. They quote scripture and history. They bless our children. They pour us a cup of tea and smile. The mechanisms they use are timeless. They create an echo chamber, an insular world where their voice is the only truth. They define a virtuous in-group against a threatening outside world. They convince ordinary people that their cruel acts are not only necessary, but noble. This pattern did not die in the 1960s. It is a virus of the human spirit, one that constantly adapts, thriving today in the digital echo chambers of the internet, in extremist cells, in any closed community where critical thought is sacrificed for the intoxicating comfort of belonging. This, then, is the final, haunting legacy of that forgotten village. It is a story that forces us to look away from the supernatural and instead turn our gaze inward and outward at the world we inhabit. It challenges the comforting belief that atrocities only happen in distant lands or during times of war, exposing the truth that the architecture of evil can be built anywhere, from the most ordinary of materials, fear, secrecy, and the desperate human yearning to belong. The case is closed, the perpetrators are gone, but the warning echoes through the years, posing a question not just about 1965, but about today. How strong is the foundation of our own community? And what horrors might we be willing to ignore in the name of keeping it quiet?